Welcome, everyone, to another episode of Natural Philosophers, the show in which I talk to some leading thinkers of the day about some fascinating topics that they've worked on. I'm your host, Dr. Siddharth Muthukrishnan. My guest today is Professor Colin Allen, who is Distinguished Professor in the Department of History and Philosophy of Science at the University of Pittsburgh, and an adjunct in the Center for the Neuro Basis for Cognition at Carnegie Mellon/Pitt. Colin is also the associate editor for the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is, in my view, one of the very best websites in the world. Colin works in a wide range of topics, including philosophy of cognitive science, philosophy of neuroscience, philosophy of mind, and philosophy of biology, among other topics. Today, I'll be talking to him about animal minds, and especially animal consciousness. This is a fascinating topic to me because it's at the intersection of many different fields: philosophy of mind, neuroscience, evolutionary biology, cognitive science, psychology, and ethics. So welcome, Colin.
Thanks, Siddharth. I'm really looking forward to this.
So to begin, let me ask the question that I want to ask all my guests, which is, what does the phrase natural philosophy mean to you? Do you think of yourself as a natural philosopher? And do you think you can identify natural philosophy in today's intellectual landscape?
Yes, well, the phrase is ambiguous, right? Am I naturally a philosopher or am I a natural philosopher? But given the historical meaning of that term, where I think there was much less separation between the way people went about investigating the world empirically and then trying to tie all of the things that they learned from those empirical investigations into some sort of coherent overall worldview, I would say yes. I'm a natural philosopher, and I think that the 20th century, in fact, can be regarded as a bit of an aberration in philosophy, where there was a strong insistence on the separation of philosophy from science. I mean, I was actually told as an undergraduate at University College London that if a question had an empirical component to it, then it was not a philosophical question. And I just think that, as I said, is a historical aberration. If you go back to many of the people who are absolutely canonical in Western philosophy, they were very clearly not just interested in science, but often fully engaged in it themselves. So I actually welcome the return of a much more scientifically engaged philosophy.
And do you think that such a scientifically engaged philosophy is making a comeback? Do you think that the 21st century might see a revival of natural philosophy in the old sense of that word?
Well, of course, I have a biased sample, right? So in our own Department of History and Philosophy of Science, and this is now the second Department of History and Philosophy of Science where I've worked, we tend to get the students who are oriented in that direction and be surrounded by faculty also with those orientations. I realize that that's not the case throughout the entire discipline of philosophy, and I think for any point of view within philosophy, there will be something like an equal and opposite reaction. So in the end, I'm somewhat pluralistic. I think it's a matter of choice to try to do philosophy in certain ways. I think I have certain arguments about why doing it in other ways is not likely to be so productive, but I'm also enough of a pluralist and maybe hopefully humble enough about my own approach to recognize that there's value in exploring those different approaches. So even the most a priori forms of philosophizing can lead, in fact, to quite interesting technological developments, such as computation theory leading to the production of the kinds of technology that's making this very interview possible.
So before we get into animal consciousness, I just want to briefly touch on your work with the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, so I came into philosophy from physics and I didn't have any formal philosophical education. So the Stanford Encyclopedia was an amazing resource that allowed me to come into this field, and it allowed me to catch up to the cutting edge of many topics very quickly. So how did you get involved in this, and what do you think is the reason that makes it so exceptional?
Yeah, that's really great to hear that it was part of your way into this discipline. Well, the person who really deserves the huge lion's share of the credit is Ed Zolter, who's the principal editor. His vision for the encyclopedia, his insistence on very high quality at all levels, whether it's the content of articles themselves or just the way in which the encyclopedia is managed on a day-to-day basis, has been absolutely fundamental in creating the quality product that we all now know and love. Now, I got into it because Ed actually started up the encyclopedia on a desktop machine that he had. And this may not mean much to all of your listeners, but he had a Next computer. So Next was the company that Steve Jobs founded when he was initially booted out of Apple and before he came back to it. So Ed had a Next Cube, and that was what he was running the encyclopedia on. And his conception was he would just give people accounts on his machine. They would upload the HTML files, and he would serve them on the web server that was built into the software of that machine. And so he was casting around for people who had enough knowledge of HTML not to be scared, philosophers in particular, who not to be scared of the technological sort of aspects of that. And it turned out that I was one of probably a half a dozen other philosophers in North America who actually had a Next Cube as well. So through a mutual friend, I was asked to write the article on animal consciousness, as a matter of fact, or I was asked to write an article, and I proposed the animal consciousness one. And that was one of the first 10 articles written on the encyclopedia. And then I think I wrote what's also the number 13 article in the encyclopedia on teleological notions in biology. So I wrote 2 of the first dozen plus articles. And in the course of talking to Ed, I asked him, well, how are you going to scale this up? How many authors are you going to have? And he said, I don't know, over 1,000 probably in the end. It's now up to about 1,800, by the way. I said, you can't give them all accounts on your machine. And he was bit of a neophyte on the Unix operating system, which is what Next was based on. And so I had actually a fair amount of experience with it. So I started working with him on some of the technical aspects and proposed the idea that we should actually have a web-based content management system, which I ended up essentially programming for the encyclopedia with the help of some funding that we obtained from the National Science Foundation and the National Endowment for the Humanities. So I got involved on the technical side as well as on the authoring side. And then in the course of building it up, we also had to develop a number of policies for how to deal with certain situations, that some of which we anticipated and some of which we didn't. So I've been involved on that sort of high-level policy decision for a while, and then I have a small portfolio of articles that I'm actually the subject editor for too. So occasionally I'm refereeing articles. And in fact, the news here relevant to our interview today is that Kristen Andrews of York University and I have just taken on the subject editorship of what's going to be a new area within the encyclopedia on animal minds. So we're actually going to be expanding the coverage of that topic in the encyclopedia.
Wonderful. And I, again, thank you and all the people who founded the encyclopedia, because I wish it keeps strong for another 100 years or more, because it's a wonderful, wonderful resource. So this brings us next to our topic of conversation, which is animal minds. One point you make in the Stanford Encyclopedia article, which I will link to in the video description, which as such is co-authored with Michael Tretzman. And you make this point that it's a bit strange to lump together non-human animals into one category if you see them from an evolutionary perspective. So can you elaborate on why we tend to do that and why that's strange?
Yeah, so there's 2 reasons, I think, to give in response to that. So one is that there's a history of that predates Darwin of thinking of all organisms as arranged on some kind of single scale, the so-called scala naturae, right? And this lends people towards thinking of higher animals and lower animals and maybe plants beneath the animals. Even Darwin himself had to write notes in his own notebooks to sort of try to remind himself not to speak in these terms, although he consistently goes back to that vocabulary in various places. But fundamentally what he did differently is introduce a tree branching structure view of the relationship of animals, right? Rather than this sort of linear progression from lower forms to higher forms. So that's the first reason. I think the second reason is that tied up in that idea of the scala naturae, but not a logical consequence of it, is that there's some sort of clear qualitative divide between humans and everything else, right? And I think that that could be true. That's an empirical question for me, whether there's a qualitative divide, although it's a conceptual question, what we mean by qualitative, right? I think that it's not a necessary consequence that you would see the necessity of such a divide, even if you have a linear scale picture. Nevertheless, the two have gone hand in hand. And so what evolution also does is discourage us from positing there being some unbridgeable gap between humans and other animals. And so that makes sort of that two category scheme seem rather artificial when applied to the facts that we find about animals.
Yeah, this is kind of surprising if you try to look at it from a naive perspective, because people look at human society and human technology and language and see it as sort of so profoundly different from anything that you can see in the animal world that they expect that, of course, there has to be some kind of biological break in the evolutionary tree. But if you look at the details, it's not at all. There isn't such a break, right? And it's kind of a puzzle as to why humans have been able to develop sophisticated technology and language despite there not being a clear biological difference between our closest ancestors and us.
Yeah, and of course, it's a little bit difficult to articulate exactly the point. So there are clear biological differences in the sense of there being anatomical differences in human brains, size differences, although there are other mammals, particularly some of the cetaceans, the whales and dolphins, that have similar sized brains. They're anatomically distributed differently, but not radically differently. You know, so you can always point to some differences and try to pin whatever difference you see in human behavior and human culture and human technology on those differences. And some story like that has to be true, but it comes back to the point I made a few moments ago, which is whether any of that adds up to a qualitative difference and what we even mean by a qualitative difference in this case. So, you know, there are plenty of other animal species that use tools and that even make tools, that form tools into the shapes that they need for particular tasks. And they pass this along in a sense that we can refer to as cultural, because not all members of the species do this, but members of a particular group are much more likely to do it than non-members of that particular group. So you can find some similar structures, and then the question is the difference merely quantitative, or is there some other kind of gap at work here? And that's, I think, the really challenging conceptual question to try to address.
So this brings us to our next question, which is, can you talk about what this field of cognitive ethology is, which you have worked on, and also from comment on its difference with respect to, say, evolutionary psychology?
Yeah, good. So cognitive ethology is a term that was invented by Donald Griffin. Donald Griffin was a very interesting biologist who spent most of his career, I think I'm correct to say, at Rockefeller University in New York. He was actually a physicist by training. And during the Second World War, it would have been, he actually was very instrumental in working on sonar-related technologies. But he was also the first to properly describe echolocation in bats. And so he approached the bats as if they were, physical devices emitting sound energy into the environment and getting the reflections back and trying to understand how they managed to then decode those signals and do something useful with them. And he, in his later career, wrote a series of books beginning in 1976 with the question of animal awareness, where he basically excoriated other people working on animal minds for being in denial about what he saw as the plain facts about animal consciousness. Now, the book, The Question of Animal Awareness, is very anecdotal. There's lots of really great and entertaining stories about, clever things that animals do. And in that sense, it's a bit of a throwback to one of Darwin's proteges, George Romanes, in the 19th century, who wrote a book on animal intelligence that was similarly full of anecdotes about clever things that animals do. And so many people saw this as a throwback and as actually a regression to something that they thought they had kicked away with more scientific methods in the 20th century. And about a year or two later, I think it was 78, a précis of that book was published in Behavioral and Brain Sciences, the journal that is actually quite important because it was the first to pioneer peer commentary on target articles. In that article, Griffin coined the term cognitive ethology to describe what he was encouraging people to do. So I should also add that the ethology has a history going back also to the early part of the 20th century, but primarily associated with the works of the German, well, actually Austrian, but German-speaking Konrad Lorenz and the Dutch Nico Tinbergen, who jointly received the Nobel Prize in the 70s for their work on establishing ethology as a field of science, which tries to understand this adaptive radiation of behaviors, right? So to go back to Darwin's picture of the tree, right? They take fully seriously the idea that there's separate lineages for all of these different species, and we have to understand, and furthermore can in fact reconstruct phylogeny from behavioral standpoint just as much as one can do from an anatomical standpoint. But they, because of the sort of mid 20th century zeitgeist, were also rather reluctant in their scientific work to take on issues of consciousness per se. So when Griffin comes along and says, nobody's paying enough attention to consciousness, and here's what you should be paying attention to, and produces a book that looks like it's could have been produced a century earlier by Romanes, except the stories are all updated, right? And arguably more scientifically grounded in terms of observations made by scientists rather than reports from farmers, as Romanes sort of ended up including. Nevertheless, you get everybody, or many of the psychologists, comparative psychologists of the day, and biologists of the day saying, we don't want to be associated with this term cognitive ethology. We're ethologists or we're comparative psychologists, but if cognitive ethology is this sort of woo-woo stuff about consciousness based on anecdotal reports, we want nothing to do with it. But you find a number of scientists who are inspired by the challenge, who are willing to take on the label despite the stigma that some people attach to it, and press forward with that label. And then there are other people who who might call themselves cognitive ethologists, but don't, partly because of the reaction that Griffin got to his work. So to name an example, I once had the opportunity to ask Frans de Waal in front of an audience whether or not he considered himself a cognitive ethologist. And he kind of hemmed and hawed for about, 15 seconds. And then he was like, yes, I suppose I am. But it was not a label that he wanted to take unwillingly.
So can you elaborate a little bit on the zeitgeist of the early part of the 20th century that you mentioned, right? Which I think has influenced a lot of different ways in which science overall has been done, including physics. And I can see its influence in the way in which sort of the foundations of quantum mechanics have been discussed. And so how did this show up in biology and psychology, and sort of just briefly tell us about its lasting heritage?
Yeah, so that's of course a big question, but right. I mean, what everybody is going to jump to first is the rise of behaviorism, particularly in the United States. And that's also interesting because ethology was very much a European project. But in the US, this sort of lab-based comparative psychology in the behaviorist tradition really took hold. And there are a number of strands one could mention there, but one begins with Thorndike, who had been a student with William James. And Thorndike actually started for his thesis work putting animals into what he called puzzle boxes. So these were complicated contraptions that required the animal to do several actions, perhaps in a specified order, in order to open up the cage and get out where there might be some food or something pulling them out. And so he charted how long, with repeated exposures, it took animals to figure their way out of the cage. And he argued that if there was anything like the kind of understanding or insight that people like Romanes had wanted to demonstrate in animals, then what you should see is some fumbling around over a number of trials. And then once they figured it out, a sudden decrease in the time that it takes them to get out, because from then on they know how to do it and they should just know how to repeat the steps. But instead, when he charted the amount of time to get out, what he found was sort of a very noisy, slow decrease. So it spikes up and down, slow decrease in time taken to get out of the cage. And so he argued that this showed a kind of trial and error learning that was not actually leading to any kind of insight, but just to some sort of habitual response eventually to the conditions of the puzzle box. And with that, then you get the idea that if we're more careful in our observations and the conditions under which we take those observations, and we adopt a more experimental approach, then we're not going to be so susceptible to these anecdotal and the other word of the era is, of course, anthropomorphic or anthropomorphized descriptions of animal behavior. And from that, you can sort of trace a lineage through people like John Watson and then B.F. Skinner towards more radical forms of behaviorism that sort of argue methodologically that the scientist, the psychologist in particular, has no real business trying to say anything about what's going on internal to the organism. Not as many philosophers think a denial that there is anything going on, just a claim about what's scientifically tractable and therefore what's scientifically respectable to assert. And in Skinner, that emerges as a form of extreme environmentalism. So our ability to predict and control animal behavior, including human behavior, should be based entirely on associations between events in the environment and behavioral responses by the organism.
Okay, so we in the 21st century have escaped the long shadow of behaviorism, so we can discuss consciousness. And so we'll turn to that next, even though the topic of behaviorism and its history is very interesting. So it's a little bit cliche to ask for a definition of consciousness. So I won't ask you for a definition because I don't think that's very productive, but maybe you can say a little bit about what kinds of things are we thinking about when we're thinking about consciousness, and sort of maybe also talk about this distinction between access and phenomenal consciousness. That seems quite useful.
Yeah, good. So I can't resist, though, comment on escaping the long shadow of behaviorism. So I think that, in fact, I heard a very prominent psychologist, not a comparative psychologist, but somebody who studies humans, say just a couple of days ago, oh, I thought we gave up all this associative learning nonsense in 1955. What? It's back in machine learning? And I think that actually what people escaped in 1955, what she's referring to is actually a couple of years later, basically Chomsky's review of Skinner's book on verbal behavior. What was escaped from there was a particular form of behaviorism, and then what subsequently became a particular caricature of behaviorism that cast a very long shadow. But I would argue that actually behaviorism in a good way is alive and well with us, not just in machine learning, but in some of the work that's, some of the best work that's still going on in comparative psychology. But that aside, onto consciousness per se, right? What are we talking about? I think that's just, that question itself is part of the central issue here, is that we don't really know what we're talking about exactly. There are, of course, philosophers who would tell you from their own insides that they exactly know what they're talking about. But I think that that's questionable and has been questionable for a long time on all sorts of grounds. But it comes down to issues about the fallibility or infallibility of self-report. At the same time, of course, a number of people, not just philosophers, but psychologists working in these areas, have tried to distinguish different notions of consciousness. So the difference between being asleep and awake, or being in a coma and awake, the difference between being currently aware that some noise is going on in the background versus being having blocked that out in some way, despite the fact that you're awake. So you're conscious in one sense, but you're not conscious of some environmental stimulus that you could be conscious of, right? These are all distinctions that people make. And of course, the big one that has exercised philosophers over the last few decades has been this issue of so-called phenomenal consciousness, sometimes also going under the term qualia or qualia, however you prefer to pronounce that, where what's under discussion is the felt quality of experience. So the fact that orange juice tastes different from coffee, and not just that it tastes different, but it tastes different in a very particular way. So those qualities of the taste of orange juice are part of what philosophers, many of them take themselves to be introspectively certain about, and then completely at a loss when it comes to explaining why a bunch of neurons firing, which is where one typically goes in this discussion, should add up to that felt quality, right? There looks like what people have called an explanatory gap there. And then a lot of philosophers want to argue about whether that explanatory gap is real or merely apparent, and if it's merely apparent, how it might be bridged, or if it even is a gap at all.
So this idea of qualia, or this felt experience, or, as the sort of cliched phrase, the redness of red and the smell of coffee and so on, this as a particular problem for explanation in both philosophy and science, is it just my impression, or is it true that this is a relatively recent topic in this area? Because, or have people problematized the problem of qualitative experience even before the 20th century?
Yeah, so I think the terminology has perhaps shifted over the time, but I think so. The notion of an explanatory gap, I mean, and that's that particular phrase can be traced to a particular paper by Joe Margolis, and the notion of there being a hard problem of making sense of this explanatory gap can be traced very specifically to work by David Chalmers. So that terminology is relatively recent. I believe, but I actually will admit to not being 100% certain of this, that the term qualia or qualia goes back maybe at least to the early part of the 20th century. But you can certainly go back to earlier stages of the discussion in the 19th century. And I mentioned William James earlier, and philosophers and psychologists around those times sort of worrying about the same kinds of issues. And in many ways, I think it's also there in the sort of Kantian split between phenomenology and other ways of thinking about the natural world, right? So as soon as I say Kantian, I mean, Kant, of course, was trying to keep everything together, but the phenomenologists afterwards sort of give experience some sort of primacy and sort of reject the idea that there's going to be any easy way to bridge the gap between our description of the from a neutral perspective or third person perspective of the phenomena that are experienced consciously. But again, they're not using the same vocabulary, and the questions are slightly different. But I don't think that the worries are particularly new.
So one thing that makes consciousness so interesting is that a lot of people feel that consciousness is very important for ethics. That is, the only beings that are, or almost the only beings that are ethically valuable or subject to ethical treatment are beings that are conscious. So animals may be conscious, so therefore we may have to worry about their ethics. Rocks, on the other hand, are almost certainly not conscious, so I don't have to worry about kicking a rock, at least insofar as it doesn't hurt me. So this feels very intuitive, but I'm curious as to whether there are actually any arguments for the connection between consciousness and ethics. And given that consciousness isn't one thing, but sort of contains many different things, which we'll get into in more detail later, do you think these differences might make a difference to ethical relevance? And in particular, what I'm thinking about is that, consciousness, at least some of it, seems to have a valence. Like some states are positive, like this conversation is enjoyable, so it's a positive state. But if if someone punches me, that's not, that doesn't seem positive, that seems very negative. But there are also experiences that are neutral, right? If I'm just sort of walking along the street without any particular thoughts that are positive or negative, I'm just in a neutral state. Can neutral consciousness also be subject to ethical considerations? So how do you think about this sort of umbrella of topics?
Good. Well, when I first started thinking about ethology and cognitive ethology, I used to joke that consciousness was above my pay grade. And then I got sort of roped into talking more about consciousness, and now I joke that ethics is above my pay grade. But I think that there's a whole bunch of really interesting and difficult to disentangle issues there. So first, is ethics, is consciousness the only relevant factor for ethical consideration? And again, there's this is outside of things that I work on directly, but I'm well aware that there are lots of people who would argue that other characteristics of organisms besides their consciousness can be sufficient for ethical respect or status or some kind of rights. So, having long-term plans and being frustrated in those plans, where frustrated just means prevented from carrying out those plans here, might be sufficient to qualify you for some sort of ethical status. And I'm pretty sure rocks don't have long-term plans either. There are a few panpsychists who think they might have a little bit of consciousness, but that's not a majority view, obviously. But certainly there are things besides consciousness that might matter. But I think that the intuition that even if there are those other things, consciousness does matter quite a lot is a pretty strong intuition. Is there a further argument for that? That's a really interesting and difficult question. I mean, my actual general take on a lot of issues in philosophy, where there are seemingly fundamentally opposing views, is that there's really, in the end, no non-question begging way of giving an argument against the opposing view. And that's symmetric, right? So we often end up with these sort of seemingly dialectically opposite views that don't obviously lend themselves to any further progress. Nevertheless, the activity of trying to figure out why we end up in that situation can be enormously clarifying for other things that we do want to do. So I don't want to sort of knock philosophy itself for ending up in that situation. Clarifying why we end up in that situation is extremely important. So yes, I think it's going to be the case that some people are just going to take it as a given that consciousness, and particularly negative affect, as Bentham said, the question is not can they think or reason, but can they suffer, right? That's sort of a given as a basis for a certain kind of ethical approach, whereas other approaches are going to take other things as given, and it's just not going to be easy to move either of those positions without begging the questions against them. And yeah. I think, sorry. So I think that once you so even though given that, then the questions about how, in fact, consciousness factors into ethics are all really interesting questions. So, is it just physical suffering? Is the physical suffering of a dog, let's say, equivalent to the physical suffering, by which I mean injury-caused suffering, let's say, of a human being or of a frog or of a grasshopper? Those are all places where people's intuitions also, I think not just philosophers, but everybody's intuitions vary. They have no qualms about squashing a cockroach, for instance, even though they think it's a sentient being, or maybe they deny it's a sentient being, right? So there are intuitions that vary about what's acceptable to do, even given the fact of sentience. And then there are varying intuitions about where sentience trails off to something that isn't actually sentient. So, those are the difficult questions here.
These questions have become sort of front and center following some of the arguments that Peter Singer has been making, since the 70s, which is pointing out that the way in which humans treat factory farmed animals is almost certainly not ethical. And so given the scale of factory farming, which some numbers estimate, somewhere like tens of billions of animals are killed every year in factory farms. So it seems to me that a kind of humility or awareness of our uncertainty regarding these matters already tells us that we probably ought to reduce these actions. So suppose it might be true that animals are not conscious, or it might be true that consciousness is not required for ethical consideration. However, are we certain enough in these claims to be willing to potentially continue committing these immense harms. So even if we are just 1% confident that these claims are true, that animals are conscious or consciousness is required for ethical consideration, given the immense size of the harms that we're committing on animals, it seems to me that we should probably stop doing that, or at least reduce it significantly. What do you think about this argument?
Yeah, so I think there are at least two dimensions to the response to that question. So one is just a general sort of precautionary type of principle, in the sense that if we don't really know what the likelihood of something is, should we be more cautious than in cases where we can be more certain? And I think that that's, I think that there are certainly agricultural practices which are clearly beyond the pale if the animals are sentient, and furthermore, I think there's a high likelihood that they are, and so we ought to be reducing that, right, or taking steps to reduce those. But that brings up the other dimension, which is it's not just the scale, but it's the actual practices themselves. So can there be humane agriculture, and can there be humane agriculture, animal raising and slaughtering at scale? So certainly the conditions for a lot of factory farms have not been great, still are not great. Is that a absolute necessity, or is the fact that you raise animals for slaughter itself some kind of moral harm, regardless of whether they think they're, you know, having a nice life, right? Those are questions which I think, again, reasonable people can perhaps disagree on, while still agreeing that if you've got a bunch of pigs in a barn that are in poor physical condition and showing other signs of distress, that ought to be stopped. Now, most of the farmers will tell you it's not in their interest to keep animals in poor physical conditions, because it actually harms the production, the growth, and the eventual profits that the farmers can make from raising those animals. So this sort of agriculture-oriented notion of animal welfare is something that they fully embrace, without necessarily even getting into the issues of animal consciousness. And you've got very prominent animal welfare scientists such as Marion Dawkins, who explicitly say, look, this question of consciousness is just too intractable scientifically. We should just do something. We should attend to the things that we can measure, and fix those things. So, you know, stress as defined physiologically, as measured by growth rates and all the rest of it, right? Those are all the things that we can do to improve the lot of animals. And that's where our scientific and ethical effort should be focused, instead of getting off, as she puts it, into you know, fruitless discussions about consciousness.
Okay, so of course this is a topic that we could spend the whole 2 hours discussing, but I want to go to consciousness itself now. So you make a distinction between two kinds of questions one might ask when it comes to animal consciousness. One is the distribution question, and the other is the phenomenological question. So can you tell us what these different questions are with respect to animals?
Good. Well, I think it actually, it's helpful to get the distinction first for humans, right? So if I were blind, but I could hear you talking about all the fabulous colors that you experience, right? I would know, I think with reasonable degree of certainty, that there is some conscious experience associated with your vision, without perhaps knowing what that would be like for me to have that experience. Now, there's some suspicion that even people who are blind might nevertheless have some residual cortical activation, which would give them a better grasp on it. But you know, those are empirical issues about the degree to which unsighted people can experience visual qualia without having any vision. And that's going to vary because blindness is not any one thing either, right? But the general point of there being some experience and having good evidence that something is having that experience versus being able to say what that experience would be like if you were to be having it, I think is a good one. So the distribution question is just who's having the experience, right? And the phenomenal question is sort of what's it like, to use a phrase that was put into the literature by Thomas Nagel, right? So I think that we can set aside the challenging questions that arise for being able to describe the phenomenology of sensory systems that might be quite different from our own in other animal species, and focus on whether or not their overall behavior, anatomy, neurophysiology give us good reasons for thinking that, or even if not good reasons, some reasons for thinking that, right? There is some kind of experience going on there, right? So rocks are out of the question. Some people want to argue about plants. You know, there's a recent paper by one of my former students about insects. You know, and so we sort of move closer and closer to us in evolutionary space. You know, you might say further and further up the scale, but as I said earlier, that's not the right way to think about it. But closer and closer to us, right? We gain more and more confidence in the overall similarities at all levels, behavioral, anatomical, physiological, being some kind of reasonable evidence for there being some kind of experience there, even if we know that actually as it's implemented in any particular species, or even members of our own species, the you know, first person understanding of that phenomenal experience might not be accessible to me. I mean, for all I know, you might have some kind of receptor expressed in your brain that makes you susceptible to certain kinds of experiences on taking certain drugs that I wouldn't have because I just lack those receptors, right? Yet you can describe to me in lots of detail all of the wonderful experiences that you have when you do this, and I'm going to say, okay, that sounds nice. I put you in the group of those where this kind of experience is distributed, but you know, as for the phenomenology of it, I'm rather limited in my ability to conceive of it.
Yeah, one of the most fascinating things that I learned ever was that I read that some people don't have visual imagery. That basically, if you ask me to imagine a red square, in my mind there just is a red square that I can sort of clearly see. But I was reading that several people don't have this way of conceptualizing. They can imagine a red square, but their imagination isn't sort of visually rich in the way that I think mine is. So yeah. This is the kind of thing that I guess you're talking about, is that, you know, are these different people have different abilities for experience. So similarly, the question is, what kinds of abilities for experience do animals of different kinds have, right?
That's right. And on the case you just raised, it's called aphantasia, right? I actually put myself on the low experience end of that scale. I mean, you know, self-report and self-diagnosis being what they are, I've done a couple of the online tests, and I think, you know, yeah, the visual phenomenology of my imagination is pretty impoverished compared to what I hear other people saying about theirs. At the same time, a lot of what I've read suggests that actually doesn't produce any cognitive deficits with respect to all sorts of quite ordinary daily tasks. So it's sort of interesting to think about to what extent that kind of rich visual phenomenology and imagination is functional for anything, and that's an area of active investigation. But yes, to your main point, which is trying to understand the experiences of animals. Right, we are like the aphantasia end of the spectrum, trying to make sense of forms of experience, whether it's chemoreceptive or electroreceptive or echolocation, you know, in other forms of animals. And we're sort of handicapped in that respect. But then actually figuring out how that phenomenology relates to function, I think that's actually one of the inroads into trying to come up with a scientific account of that aspect of consciousness. What difference does it make if you have that phenomenology?
Yeah, so actually, maybe we can actually talk about this now. So one of the questions that confuses people, including me, is what really is the function of consciousness? It seems like we can't do anything without it, at least from a first personal perspective. But then once you reflect on it, it turns out we do all kinds of things without it. I'm not conscious of the way in which my brain is controlling my heartbeat or my breathing, but it seems to be doing it just fine. I can become conscious of my breathing if I choose to, but I have very little control over how it controls blood pressure or heartbeat or things like that. So I know that there's this distinction that people make when thinking about consciousness between structure and function. So maybe tell us what this distinction is and what are some suggestions for what the function of consciousness might be.
Yeah, good. So I want to start though by commenting on the fact that you went to things like heartbeat and breathing, which are relatively autonomic. Breathing, I can, of course, decide to hold my breath up to a point. Eventually, the urge to breathe will be so strong that I would be a very odd individual indeed if I could overcome that. So there we have a system over which we can exert some degree of conscious control, but normally we don't. Normally it just goes on in the background. But I was also going to mention that even in the act of speaking, you're moving your tongue and your lips and other parts of your throat around in very complex ways. You have no idea what you're doing there, although one can become aware of it. So you might realize that if you are going to make a certain kind of sound, then you're moving your tongue to the front of your mouth rather than the back of your mouth. And this, actually having this kind of thing pointed out to you can improve your ability to pronounce words in non-native languages, right? So, oh, you'll sound much more native if you put your tongue there, right? So again, we can come to have some degree of conscious control over that, but then it only becomes fluent and natural. It becomes automated again, right? So if you always have to think about how you're moving your lips and placing your tongue, etc., in order to make certain sounds, you are going to be speaking rather slowly. So there's this sort of very layered system here, right? With sort of, for want of a better term, some degree of conscious top-level control. I decide to say the word daffodil. I have no idea where that just came from, but there it is, right? It's got nothing to do with anything that we've talked about so far in this conversation, but if I decide to say daffodil, I can say daffodil, all right? Now, I've said daffodil once, it's going to come out another 10 times before I stop saying it as well, because I don't have control over the degree of activation, the priming, as it were, now for saying daffodil. And we see this all over the place in human behavior, but human linguistic behavior is a nice place to start. You'll notice that if you look at people's writing, their use of words is bursty, right? They'll use a word that they hardly ever use, and then it'll crop up again for the next page or so, and then it goes back to its sort of background rate. Right? So this kind of structure is really in the production of our behavior is, I think, one one inroad into thinking about the function of consciousness, or at least the role of consciousness. And so let me just detour slightly to go back to your structure versus function, because that comes up in a more normal anatomical context. So the fact that I have an opposable thumb, right, that's a structural property of my hand that not all animals share, right? But the fact that I have this opposable thumb also allows certain functions which presumably are not the evolutionary cause of my having an opposable thumb, but it might have other functions, such as being able to finely manipulate things and knock flakes off rocks and so on, right? That would have an evolutionary selective adaptive story, right? So biologists have long discussed what the role is between structure and function, because in many cases they're interested in trying to infer function from structure, because in fossils all you have is the structure, right? At least in fossilized bones, all you have is the structure. There actually are fossil traces of behavior, footprints and things like that, right? Which have some structural features, but also tell you where the animal was walking, which is a behavioral fact, right? So those are, but those are sort of why biologists have been interested in this relationship between structure and function, and the degree to which one can or cannot make functional inferences from the structure. Now, if we come back to the cognitive domain, the psychological domain, I just gave you an account of the production of behavior where it's rather hierarchical. At some high level, I decide to say that word daffodil again. And notice that I'm able to dredge that up, even though I hadn't said that word now for what, 2-3 minutes, right? It was still the word that came to mind as I was ballistically running through the sentence with actually no idea what the last word of the sentence was going to be, right? So there's all of this stuff going on beneath the surface that has to be understandable in terms of the neuroanatomy and other aspects of the bodily physiology and the environmental context, right? If there were a daffodil on my desk right now, there would be a nice explanation of why I came up with that word. There isn't, so it really did come out of my own insides, as it were, right, in this context, except of course, I only can do that because sometime in the past, somebody pointed out daffodils and told me those were daffodils, and I had repeated experience with daffodils, right? And here I am being bursty again with that word, right? So all of this is ongoing. So now what's consciousness in all of this, right? Well, here I'm inclined towards thinking of this as some sort of what's known in this literature as global workspace theory. So Bernie Bars is a neuroscientist who coins that term, but similar ideas float around in various ways. But the idea is that above a certain, well, there are many ways of catching out the idea, but one way sort of intuitively to catch it out is above a certain threshold of neural activity. What's going on in one part of the brain can couple or bind or cause things in other parts of the brain. And you can tell, again, various kinds of stories about how this works, but you might get something like synchronous firing across diverse regions of the brain. And that enables then binding between certain kinds of, again, for want of a better term, information that is related to the organism's past and present goals and future behavior, right, to be sort of co-activated and then used productively to do some task. So daffodil was just a word that came out of who knows where for this particular conversation. But more generally, if you and I are talking about the topic of consciousness, that already has activated a whole bunch of other associated terms, including ethology for me, but not for everybody. Not everybody's going to think of ethology when they think of consciousness, right? But it's that activation and that sort of enables all sorts of other relationships to be productively combined into what I hope is a useful conversation here. Now that we're just talking, right? And especially we're talking philosophy, which, some people think is maybe not the most useful thing one could be doing. But I think the same general sorts of things are at work, even in various kinds of very embodied and even mechanical tasks. So take riding my bicycle, right? As soon as I'm on that bicycle, all sorts of stored information is now primed to become conscious when I need it, right? Primed to enter this global workspace in a way that while I'm routinely riding along doing the things I normally do on a bicycle, it's like flapping my tongue when I'm saying daffodil. I don't have to think about that, right? But if I need to, I can. So for instance, I just upgraded the components on my bicycle, and now the shifting controls are different. So for the last couple of weeks, I've been retraining myself, right, to what do I push in order to get the shift that I want, because it's a very different pattern from what I had before. And so that kind of conscious top-down recollection that I'm on the bicycle and the bicycle isn't the same as it was before. And I've been told that, if I want this to happen, I have to push this button. And if I want that to happen, I have to push that button. And if I want the other thing to happen, I have to push them both simultaneously, right? That's playing an active role during this training period in my responses to conditions such as going uphill or fighting a headwind or whatever it is, right? But I know 6 months from now, it'll be so thoroughly automated, I won't have to even think about it, right? So consciousness becomes this way of thinking about how information from diverse sources, this theory of consciousness wanted to think about how information from diverse sources can be dynamically sort of combined into adaptive action in circumstances that are relatively unfamiliar or slightly different from things that you've seen before. And I think once we understand that, we also begin to see that the temporal dimension of that workspace could vary greatly from species to species. So maybe as a human being, I can keep daffodil active for 40 minutes or so during this conversation because I've got a big enough brain, right, to do that. Whereas for an organism with a much smaller brain, things that happen in the past few seconds are going to be active, but eventually they're going to be swamped out by other things that are happening more recently. That's just going to dissolve to some kind of background noise, right? So I think we can recognize both then different temporal structure to consciousness in different organisms, and of course different content. So for a dog, its recollection of the smells that it encountered 20 minutes ago on the outbound portion of a walk will drive its behavior on the return portion of its walk. Whereas for a human being, you weren't even aware of those smells in the first place. It's not that your behavior can't be controlled by smell or that you can't become conscious of it, but most of the time, smell is so relatively unpredictive of how we're gonna, let's say the smell of things in the street is relatively unpredictable of how we should carry out our walk, that we've habituated to any information that might nevertheless be available there. But to a dog, it's a highly relevant social signal. So once we get both the sort of the temporal structure of consciousness, right, and the sensory structure of consciousness, I think we can begin to tell a story about the function of consciousness, right? It's there because it is just the ability to relate information to drive behavior in a relatively top-down way in circumstances that are discriminable from the things that you can just take for granted and act automatically upon.
So some people worry that this kind of theory proves too much. So for example, I think Schutzgebel has argued that if you buy this kind of theory, then you might also have to buy that the United States as an entity is conscious, because it also integrates information or takes information from many different streams, collects them, processes them, and directs top-down action. And you might be willing to say, okay, that's fine, but to many people, that seems wildly implausible that the United States as an entity is conscious. So how do you think about this case?
Yeah, good. So I thought about this a little bit in connection with the paper that I wrote with another philosopher, Gerhard Theine, and psychologist, Rob Goldstone. So in that paper, we're not focused on consciousness. We're actually focused on cognition. So rethinking group cognition is the paper. And there we think about the way in which cognitive predicates can be applied to collectives, such as you might think the United States, but even small groups of people interacting with each other on some problem-solving task, right? And my thinking there is that in general, there can be no a priori reason for thinking that you can't have any phenomenon that can emerge at a lower level also available at larger level. Actually, I prefer the term scale there, right? So it might be that you need a minimum number of some units, be they cells or whatever, in order to get get some higher level properties such as consciousness, right? But once you've got enough stuff to generate consciousness, then more stuff is there to get consciousness, right? Now, the other part of this, though, is not any old lumping together of stuff will give you the right structure. So I think, Schutzgebel would be right if the theory of consciousness was just there's some sort of interaction, right? But I was at least intending, if not succeeding, to try to give a more or point towards a more specific story about the exact requirements on the degrees and kinds of coupling that exist between the various elements that combine to produce this global workspace, right? So it's not just that we've got to, we can describe it as abstractly as you report, Eric Schutzgebel reporting it, but I think any real theory has to go well beyond that kind of abstract description. And so if we think of this in terms of coupled systems again, right? So I'm obviously importing ideas from dynamical systems theory and complexity theory and so on here, which ultimately also goes back to, I guess, thermodynamics. So that's back more in your wheelhouse here. But we think in terms of coupled systems, and think about brains for a moment. What you've got is a relatively tightly coupled set of cells, right? And they're coupled in specific ways. They're coupled in ways that also that operate over various timescales. So you have direct synaptic influences from cell to cell, which are more like point-to-point connections. But you also have other kinds of more diffusive kinds of couplings that have to do with neurotransmitters that are not being used just in the synapses, but the very same molecules diffuse over various regions of the brain and act in a more neuromodulatory way that then actually increases the gain or decreases the gain on the synapses. So you've got this very complicated feedback system between firing and the whole dynamic space in which that firing is taking place. And if we're specific enough about that, then it's not implausible that you could have, implausible is probably the wrong word. It's not impossible that you could have the same sort of coupling between all of the individual human beings making up the collective that is the United States government, or whatever we want to call the United States here. But it's rather implausible that you could actually accomplish the same degree of coupling between the parts that a brain has. That is, actually engineering things in such a way, right, or socially organizing things in such a way that you had the kinds of degree of coordination that exists within a single brain, would be a rather difficult, albeit not a priori impossible trick to pull off. And that for me is why I think it's rather unlikely that the United States is conscious, or that these theories literally imply that it is. Of course, a very vague account of the theory very vaguely implies it, but that's not doing science as far as I'm concerned. And much as I love Eric, you know, I think he tends sometimes towards these sort of rather quick, armchairy kinds of arguments, even though he's sort of pulling them from scientific interests. And that allows me to introduce one more thing here. So another theory that I find intriguing here in consciousness, and I find it complementary to the global workspace kinds of ideas, are Giulio Tononi's ideas about information integration. Now, there are a lot of things to say about why that can't possibly be the whole story, because I think the function of brains is not just to integrate information coming in, but to be predictive in some ways of what certain actions of the organism itself are going to produce and other things going on in the environment. So some part of the predictive brain hypothesis is also true, right? And the other main beef with the information integration theory is that it has some good toy models, right? But it's actually not really computable as a measure when applied to real nervous systems. And this is something that Tononi and others freely admit, right? But nevertheless, I think the idea that through the kinds of very architecturally organized systems that we see in animals, namely their nervous systems, and whatever parts of the body those nervous systems are coupled to, right? We have a way of thinking about how the sensory surfaces are driving the inner parts of the system in ways that then also come back out in the motor system in various ways. That when that story is told is going to require far more detail than just, oh, it's information integration in a global workspace. If that's your theory, I agree, you don't have much. But I see a route there towards actually developing much more specific theories.
So this is slightly, we're digressing a bit from animals, but that's fine. So this is really interesting about this. You need a kind of very fine-grained and strong coupling between the individual components on a sort of rather short time scale to have some hope of ascribing consciousness. But this seems to me to suggest that robots and certain sophisticated computers, which do have very tight coupling between the transistors at a very fast time scale, could in fact be conscious on these kinds of theories. Do you think that's fair?
Yeah, so it depends what you mean by could there. So do I think there's any reason in principle for thinking that we can't build a conscious machine out of those kinds of components? I say no, there's no reason to think that can't be done. Do I think that any of the actual robots that we have or computers that we use are conscious? I think not. I think that they're still constructed on much more stepwise processing with they lack the kind of complex dynamics that I suspect is underlying the adaptive capacity that we see in even quite basic organisms, right? So whatever it is that makes a cockroach able to change its behavior in response to environmental conditions in ways that are adaptive for the cockroach is something I think is still absolutely lacking, except in very toy sense in any robots that we have.
Okay, so let's go back to animals. So we have some candidate theories on the table that tell you what kind of phenomena need to happen for us to be able to say that a certain being is conscious. So now suppose we want to use these kinds of theories to decide whether a certain animal or a certain set of animals are conscious or not. And how would you go about doing this? Is it a neurological task? Is it a behavioral task? A combination of all of these three? Are there like any success cases that you think about when you think about this problem?
Yeah, I mean, I think at this point it has to be some kind of combination of all of the above. I mean, in terms of successes, though, I think that one of the things that's happened over the last 20, 30 years is a realization that animals are much less stimulus bound than was commonly supposed in certain areas of science and even in the common imagination. So by less stimulus bound, I mean that what an animal does in any given situation is not very predictable just from its immediate environmental context, the cues that are available to it. Of course, we are all stimulus bound in various ways. If you perceive a bus bearing down on you, you will leap out of the way unless you've got some other thing going on, right? So there's a degree to which we are necessarily reactive to things that are happening in the immediate environment. But even going back to the 1940s, there was the beginning of accumulation of evidence that even rats in mazes in laboratories were not simply responding to the contingencies afforded by the environment and the rewards that they had received by their previous behavior in those environments. So the work of Edward Tolman, sort of showed that rats will actively explore new mazes even when they're not being rewarded for it. Then when you introduce some task within that maze, such as to get to some part of it to find some food, they're much faster in being able to successfully carry out that task than a naive rat that's never seen the maze before. So they have learned something about the maze, even though they weren't being rewarded in the way that Thorndike or Skinner would have assumed it was necessary for them to learn under instrumental or operant learning, right? So I think that over the last number of years, there's been much more realization that these organisms are actually much more flexible and capable in their behavior than was commonly supposed. They're not just stimulus response machines. And even people who still pursue, broadly speaking, Pavlovian learning research programs will tell you that Pavlov was never telling us that it was just a hardwired stimulus response, an acquired hardwired stimulus response. But there was always a lot more going on in that kind of situation. But the experimental conditions that psychologists used were explicitly designed in various ways to standardize organism responses, because that's how you get good data to support your theories, right? So there was sort of this feedback loop, as it were, between increasingly stereotyped learning conditions, epitomized by the Skinner box, right? And then what looked like a sort of fairly rigid account of how organisms behave. And what's happened over the last 30 years has been a much needed reconvergence of ethology, this more biological tradition of studying animal behavior evolutionarily and in the wild. Oh, and this makes me remember, speaking of echoes of Come Sage Pest, I never answer your question about how it differs from evolutionary psychology, but this issue of thinking about what animals are doing in their natural environment foods, and how then and the kind of adaptivity they display in those natural environments, which, by the way, drove a lot of the kinds of anecdotes that Donald Griffin wanted to put on the table as evidence for conscious thinking, right? Thinking about all of that then feeds back into the design of experiments that try to go after what animals would be good at, rather than going after things that suited the experimenter's convenience in sort of standardizing the conditions under which they were tested, right? But I'll add to that, the late Bill Timberlake, who was a psychologist, a comparative psychologist at Indiana University, always loved to point out that the fact that psychologists, comparative psychologists, run rats but not pigeons through mazes already reflects some kind of implicit understanding of the species differences, right? Rats live in tunnels. In fact, the whole idea of putting rats in mazes in the lab came about because a psychologist demolished a shed in his backyard and found a whole bunch of tunnels underneath where the rats had been burrowing, right? There was the maze, right? So whether they knew it or not, Timberlake always argued, even the most behavioristic of psychologists were actually relying on ethological facts about animals in order to get conditions under which they could do experiments that they could then standardize. And you train pigeons to peck, right? You don't train a rat to peck, you train a rat to push a lever with its foot because they handle food when eating it, right? Whereas pigeons, of course, don't have hands. So all of these ethological differences were in fact built into the practice of lab psychology, but never acknowledged as such, right? And what's really happened now is greater and greater acknowledgement of that, and more design of experiments which try then to tap into what we know about this evolutionary radiation of species, and then trying to understand that adaptive diversity and the flexibility that organisms show within that space.
Yeah, I mean, this I think is one of the most interesting sort of counter revolutions that I see in psychology, is that a lot of the psychological knowledge has been obtained by testing in very sort of controlled, standardized, sterile environments. And people are realizing that the lessons that you learn from those contexts very rarely transfer to the sort of rich contexts in which humans and animals are embedded in, right? And I think this is, for example, one of the critiques of intelligence testing is that, so in societies without sort of education systems, you might find that IQ scores are lower, but clearly it would be silly to say that people aren't solving complex problems and making intelligent decisions. It's just that they don't have that kind of a context of sitting in a room and taking a test, right? And answering very sort of context-free questions in a way. And yeah, so it's kind of interesting to me that this shows up in the animal context as well, that you really need to put the ecology and the environment of the animals back in place to fully understand their cognition.
Yeah, I think you raise a really interesting comparison there, an important one. And to take that first in the direction of animals, it's not just that you're dropping the animal into a kind of standardized, sterilized environment. The animal that you're dropping into that environment is one that has not had the experiences. It's been raised in cages, often without a normal kind of socialization process, although that's changing too, right? So people are beginning to realize that you get more interesting behavior out of, let's say, monkey subjects if you let them live in a somewhat normal family group before you do your experiments with them. There's an awful lot that's acquired there. And then flipping over to the human case, yes, absolutely, right? So I think it's a really interesting question historically, why the culture of, let's say, the educated West is one that has valorized and then trained children to be good at these kinds of very abstract tasks. And you could try to make some kind of adaptive argument, but you could also just point to various historical contingencies. So, first, just going back into the 20th century, the origin of so-called intelligence tests actually comes out of Watson being booted out of academia, one of the original behaviorists, and sort of then going into psychometric testing. And these tests became widely adopted by government and business as entrees into their ranks. And you might wonder whether it suited them to use these tests, because that ended up then allowing them to select, quote, the right kind of people, meaning the people who'd had the very kinds of educations that made them good at those tests, which were not the impoverished Southern poor, right? It was the well-educated upper Midwesterners and all the rest of it, right? And Northeasterners, right? So you get this kind of societal feedback, reinforcement of this being the goal of education, because you want that kind of job, you better be good at taking these kinds of tests. And so it kind of runs away with no real grounding, I think, in showing that these tests actually produce the kind of capacities, or tests for the kinds of capacities that will serve well in a broader range of applications. And I think that's behind, and rightly so, behind a lot of the movement to get more diversity into all sorts of workplaces, including universities at the moment. Going back even further, I'm reminded too of one of my absolute favorite passages from Charles Dickens. So in the book Hard Times, he's considering the effects on education of the Industrial Revolution. So now we're going back to the early 1800s in Britain. And one of the main characters in the book is a teacher with the wonderfully Dickensian name of Mr. Gradgrind. So Gradgrind is running a class, and he calls on one of the students, who happens to be a girl, and says, your father works with horses, doesn't he? Tell us something about horses. So the girl stammers and sputters a few things out about, and the teacher interrogates her about some of the things about horses, but he's really unsatisfied with the answer. So then he turns to one of the boys and says, okay, but so your definition of the horse. And the boy rattles off, quadrupedal, graminivorous, has 42 teeth, whatever the list is. And at that point, the teacher says, very good, and turns back to the girl and says, there, now you know what a horse is. It's like, what's the value of that kind of classificatory knowledge for somebody who actually really works with horses, right? And I think our whole education system is sort of built around the idea that there's value to this kind of abstraction, knowing the names of things, right? Rather than knowing how actually to work with a horse, right? Which is fundamentally problematic when you're thinking about intelligence, the evolution of intelligence, the nature of cognition, the function of consciousness, and all the rest of it.
Yeah, that's a great story. Thanks. So coming back to animals, and I think this actually is a nice bridge to my next question, which is, so what do you think is the relation between consciousness and learning, and also memory? So one of the ways in which we think we ascribe consciousness to animals is if the animals can perform complex learning tasks. So do you think that there is some inextricable connection between consciousness and learning, and if there's a good way to ascribe consciousness to animals?
Good. So the first thing I want to do is actually point out that there are many different forms of learning. So it's probably not going to be sufficient just to talk about consciousness and learning. We're going to have to talk about consciousness and particular kinds of learning. Now, what do I mean by kinds of learning? That's actually an interesting kind of question for basic cognitive ontology, if you like. So one of my erstwhile collaborators, Jim Grau, who's a neuropsychologist at Texas A&M University, where I had my first faculty job, likes to point out that the way in which psychologists teach learning Pavlovian conditioning, Skinnerian operant conditioning, etc., isn't really, on his view, a description of different kinds of learning. It's actually a description of different kinds of experimental protocols. If you do this, then you'll get that, right? And he argues for what he calls a neurofunctional approach, where we actually try to understand what the mechanisms are that underlie the changes in behavior, the long-term changes in behavior that you see in these different experimental protocols. And you might find out, it's an empirical question, for instance, that one and the same mechanism is being used, right, in these rather different experimental protocols. And that partly underlies also what I said earlier about even Pavlovian conditioning not being exactly what it is in the popular imagination. There's a lot more going on in Pavlovian cognition than most people sort of have from their caricature view of it, right? So when we ask about the relationship between consciousness and learning, I want to say, well, what kind of learning are we talking about? And I want to be somewhat careful about how we taxonomize learning. But in the absence of a good taxonomy, we're sort of thrown back on thinking about protocols again, right? Experimental protocols. So one of the most interesting cases for thinking about this is a distinction between what in the literature is called trace conditioning and delay conditioning. So if you think about a standard Pavlovian conditioning, some stimulus comes on, and then another stimulus appears. And that second stimulus is known as the unconditioned stimulus because it's something that produces a response in the organism anyway. And over enough repetitions of that first stimulus, which is known as the CS or the conditioned stimulus, and the US, the unconditioned stimulus, eventually the organism will start producing its response to the CS alone. All right, the conditioned stimulus alone. And that's the basic structure of Pavlovian conditioning. And then it's called a conditioned response because you've shifted an unconditioned response to some unconditioned stimulus over to a conditioned stimulus producing that same response, okay? Now, it turns out there are two ways of bringing up the CS in the US. I could bring up the CS, take it away, and then bring up the US. Or I can bring up the CS and while it's still present, at some offset, some delay, then bring up the US, the second stimulus, the one to which the organism has a response, okay? So that second way of doing it is called delay conditioning, right? The first way of doing it, where I first show you one stimulus, then take it away, then give you another stimulus, then look for your response. That's called trace conditioning. The obvious idea being there must be, if you're going to eventually acquire this response to the CS as a result of being made to respond by the secondary presentation of the US, it must be because you're internally maintaining some trace of the initial stimulus in order to pair it, to associate it with the second stimulus, right? So trace conditioning versus delay conditioning. And it turns out that there's all sorts of interesting things that give us, I think, empirical inroads with this particular approach to thinking about consciousness in non-human animals. And I want to sort of preface what I'm going to explain here by saying, I don't think it's the only way, but this is just one way to make a connection. So first, there's all kinds of information about the different kinds of temporal boundedness of these kinds of conditioning in different species, right? So how long after the presentation of the US, the unconditioned, presentation of the CS, the conditioned stimulus, can the US be presented for the animal still to make the association, all right? How long is that possible? Is it 1 second, 5 seconds, 10 weeks, you know, right? I mean, in theory, right? I could present you something now and then 10 weeks later get you to respond to something and you could make that connection. But no biological organism that I'm aware of is conditionable over that kind of time span. They're all shorter, but it varies from species to species, right? And then that temporal dynamics can also differ between trace conditioning and delay conditioning, right? So maybe we can tease apart the two. Now, why is that relevant to consciousness? Well, so really interesting experiment that was done about 20 years ago and published in Science, but has been repeated in various ways, looked at both trace and delay conditioning in both humans and rabbits, it turns out. And the particular experimental protocol is what's called Iblink reflex conditioning. So all mammals basically have, or at least all terrestrial mammals, I don't know about the whales and dolphins, but all terrestrial mammals have a Iblink reflex. That means that if a puff of air hits your eye, you will blink, right? So the unconditioned stimulus is the puff of air, the unconditioned response is the blink. And basically all mammals, or at least terrestrial mammals, can be conditioned in a generally Pavlovian way to produce that blink anticipatorily given something like a tone going off. So if I go beep and then a short while later give you the puff of air, eventually you will start blinking in response to that beep at the appropriate offset based on what the delay was in your condition, right? So standard delay conditioning, if I put a mammal, including a human being, into this condition, use standard delay conditioning. Remember, that's the form where both stimuli are for some time present simultaneously. 100% of subjects acquire the response, okay? If, however, we switch to trace conditioning, right? So first comes the beep, goes away, then comes the puff of air, right? Only about roughly half of humans and rabbits acquire the response. Now you can do something further with humans that you can't do with rabbits. I mean, rabbits, of course, you can't tell them why they're in this experiment or even that they're in an experiment at all. The humans know they're in an experiment, but you can hide from them the purpose of the experiment. You can tell them, oh, I just want you to look at the screen and report what you see on the screen, not telling them that, in fact, they're going to be given a puff of air and that there might be some other cues around, right? So you can obscure the purpose of the research from the human subject. And then afterwards, you can ask them, were you aware of anything other than, you know, the task we gave you to do going on during that session? And in the case of trace conditioning, it was absolutely striking that the half of the subjects who acquired the response could all indicate verbally that they were aware that there was a puff of air following a tone, all right? And those who didn't acquire the response couldn't report it. If you ask the same question in the standard delay conditioning, about half of the people can tell you, yeah, there was a tone followed by a puff of air or something that indicates their awareness of at least the stimulus, right? And about half of them can't. So it looks like consciousness is tightly coupled to trace conditioning, but not delay conditioning, right? The profile is rather similar between rabbits and humans. So we can't ask the rabbits, were you aware? At least nobody's figured out how to ask that question of them, right? And furthermore, tying it back to what I was saying earlier about global workspace kinds of views, it makes sense that if you're actually going to acquire a trace conditioned response, somewhere that initial presentation of the CS has to be buffered, right? And in the humans, at least, we've got evidence that that buffering is conscious buffering, right? So it feeds into then a functional story about what consciousness, or one of the things that consciousness might be good for, is that it is the place where we keep alive the kinds of recent events, right, that may turn out to be important for learning about things, other things that are about to happen, right? And so I really like this example because I think it ties all of these different pieces of the conversation together. And again, of course, the inference then that the rabbits are also conscious when they're being trace conditioned if they acquire it is at this point not quite as on firm grounds as the human inference. But if neuroanatomically, yeah, their brains are smaller, but they're mammals, so the pieces are more or less all there. If we could determine that sort of everything more or less is in place, yeah, they might not be able to do it over such a long time span. Yeah, they won't be able to do it with all the same stimuli as we can, but maybe they can do it with some stimuli that we can't. They might be more conditionable on smell, for instance, in a trace way. All of these differences can be teased apart in a system such as this. And that's just one example. So that's a really long-winded answer to your question, what's the relationship between consciousness and learning? But I think what philosophers of the science need to do in this is get a whole lot more sophisticated about what they mean by terms like learning.
That's a great answer because it really described this elegant experiment that ties back to what we were talking about. And what a lovely experiment, I should say, that tries to that sidesteps the obstacle of not being able to ask rabbits whether they're aware of that learning experience or not. Yeah, so I guess we're coming up towards the end of the conversation. So if I could just get a couple more questions out there. So one thing that was interesting to me really is this idea that some people have argued for, that consciousness originated with vertebrates. And the argument there involves that vertebrates had to solve a set of sort of what gets called neurologistical problems. And that was very interesting to me. So what are these neurologistical problems and how might consciousness go about solving them?
Yeah, good. So, I mean, there are roughly two sorts of views here about the origins of some sort of felt experience. And as you rightly say, one of those views locates it with vertebrates. The other relates it much earlier. So let me just, by contrast, give you the much earlier view. And that I associate with Eva Jablonka and Hannah Ginsberg, is the idea that there's some sort of affective tone that's important for organisms of almost any complexity in order to detect disruptions from what you might think of as viable homeostatic range, right? So this actually goes back to your earlier question about, can I just be in a neutral state of consciousness? And the answer is, well, even if you're just walking down the road and not particularly feeling anything negative or anything positive, you nevertheless have the sense that nothing urgent is pressing. You're kind of in a zone of comfort, right? Where this is kind of where you want to be, because higher affect things can't last, right? Eventually they become enervated. Lower or more negative affect things, you're sort of got to do something to get rid of that, right? So that's sort of one view of the origin of sort of the basic affective background against which consciousness and coming to consciousness is sort of viewed as disruptions of that, right? But I think that the other story, which is due to Feinberg and Mallet, among other people, in their book on the ancient origins of consciousness, is one in which the origins of consciousness have much more to do with problems that organisms face when they are required to move long distances or relatively long distances compared to their body scale under conditions where there are both threats that they must avoid and resources that they must attain. So they tell an evolutionary story in which very early on, the bottoms of the ocean were basically matted with bacterial colonies. And if you were a very early animal, basically a worm-like creature wiggling around in this mat. The mats were big enough, extensive enough that you didn't need to really worry about where you were going. It was just food as far as you could imagine going, right? No imagination either. But what happened, they argue, with the Cambrian explosion and the rapid diversification of invertebrate life forms is that more predators appeared, and for other reasons that they go into in a little bit in their book, but again, that's not their primary research. But for other reasons, these mats began to shrink, so they became more like, if you like, ponds or lakes, right? That could be exhausted by some group of organisms that are still making their living by consuming this stuff, right? So now, if you've consumed your local pond of this food stuff, you've now got the problem of finding another one and getting to it in a way that doesn't get you eaten by some nasty, crab-like creature, or, even more ancient sort of, some of those amazing sort of Cambrian invertebrates, both vicious looking and amazing looking at the same time, right? So that puts a premium, they argue, then on being able to remotely sense location of food and location of predators. And in that story, vision becomes particularly important because that's our most powerful distal sensory ability. Of course, all senses, sound and so on, give us some information about things that are separate from us. Only touch requires direct contact. But vision becomes very dominant in this view. And then, but then, and this is, maybe I'm putting words in their mouths a little bit here, but not too much given their theory. It becomes also important to integrate the information from these different senses, while at the same time having an advantage if you can both integrate and keep track of which sense gave you which piece of information. Because part of the learning problem is which sense is actually more reliable in any given circumstance. I might trust how the thing smells if I'm wondering whether to eat this piece of meat than how it looks. It might look fine to eat, but it might smell terrible, right? So I have to learn, an organism has to learn which sense to trust. So it has to keep the senses separate, but it also has to solve problems in which information from multiple senses is actually adding up to the judgment, the decision, right? So you can hold your nose and eat stinking fruit and it tastes delicious and it won't kill you, right? And you can learn that, right? So they tell a story based on neuroanatomy about how early vertebrate structures in the nervous system support this combined integration with separate channels that they say is there even in the earliest protofishes, right? And that then gets elaborated in various ways in different lineages in different kinds of vertebrates. And I think it's a really interesting and compelling story. And it's one also that I think you can see can be kind of attached to all the other things that I have said about the need for some sort of workspace in which information from different sources is being tracked separately, but nevertheless combined to produce the right adaptive response in whatever circumstance you find yourself in.
Yeah, and it's very interesting to me about this sort of deciding which sense to trust more or how to combine evidence from many different sources. And one interesting aspect of these kinds of theories is that one of the ways in which you have to maintain stability is against your own behavior, right? I mean, we have all seen sort of footage filmed by someone just holding a cell phone camera or wearing a camera on their head, and it looks awful. But then you think about it, well, that's exactly what my eyes are doing all the time. But nevertheless, the way the world appears to me when I'm walking around is stable and doesn't have that kind of shakiness to it that I would feel from sort of handheld footage. So, and so my brain must be sort of editing out or stabilizing that image in a way. And so these kinds of theories, am I right in saying that they say that consciousness is sort of arises when the organisms have to stabilize their own, stabilize against their own motion?
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And of course, we've got software for modern cameras and so on that does that kind of image stabilization. So it's not as awful as it used to be. So I do want to, though, resist the kind of picture that Daniel Dennett's been very good about trying to combat over the years, which is the idea that there's some sort of internal theater, that he calls it the Cartesian theater, in which this stabilized image becomes available for viewing by a conscious self, right? I think we have to avoid some sort of homuncular regress there. I think he's absolutely right about that. But that said, right, the basic problem of stabilization, detecting invariances. So, I have an object and I move it around. I don't perceive it as changing shape, even though what's being projected onto my retina is in fact changing shape, right? So somehow or other, I detect the cylindricality of the bottle, regardless of whether I'm moving or it's being moved by something external to me. I mean, I picked it up, so I was causing the movement in that case. One way in which we learn, I think, a lot of this is, in fact, during very early development, where kids are always picking up things and doing this kind of thing, right? So they learn what changes and what doesn't change over that. And of course, they've got multisensory feedback. So as I'm rotating, the feeling on my fingers is not changing in a way that indicates a change of shape. It indicates a change of orientation because I'm getting different pressure on the different fingers depending on what angle I'm holding this at, right? But all of that is being combined in this enormously complex way that we still have just the really most rudimentary understanding of, that I think is also why our robots are so terrible at the moment. It's like, the sheer bandwidth required to do this, right? And to do it in a way that's adaptive to growth in the body, right? So how it felt to me when my hand was half this size is different from how it feels to me now. How it feels to me now with a certain amount of, age-induced stiffness in my joints is different from how it felt 15 years ago when I didn't have so much of that, right? So our brains are continuously adapting to our changing bodies, and finding how to stabilize the information we get, actually extract the real information from this incredibly noisy signal. One of the great advances in machine learning has been the realization that the real problem early on was just lack of data, right? And we're still trying to do face recognition from images, static images only. But you and I don't solve face recognition problems from static images, right? We solve it from images of people that we interact with. And in fact, if I had only ever met you on screen, I would bet, I don't know if this experiment was done, but I would bet that I'm much more likely to confuse you with other people than having met you off screen, and therefore having a much better, for want of a better word, internal representation of the relatively stable shape of your head, right? From whatever angle I happen to be looking at it. And that isn't to say I wouldn't confuse you for somebody else under certain circumstances, but it's less likely than if all I've got is flat images.
So another theory locates consciousness with something called amnios. So what are amnios? And can you very briefly say why people think that only amniotes are conscious?
Yeah. Well, amniotes are those vertebrates that are basically terrestrial. So in the move from aquatic life forms to living on land, any organism that is obligatorily on land and therefore must reproduce on land and therefore must protect its developing embryo, if it's an egg layer, must provide some kind of package that protects that developing embryo. And that's what we stereotypically think of as an egg, right? A chicken's egg is an amniotic egg because it has all of these barriers around it that make it viable in a dry, warm environment. Frogs and other amphibians have to go back to the water, right, to lay their eggs. Their eggs don't have those kinds of protections, right? So it turns out that being terrestrial in this way correlates them with having certain kinds of amniotic structures, which, by the way, in mammals which have internalized that, I mean, so the monotremes still lay eggs, right? The echidna platypus, right? Still lay eggs. Those are mammals, egg-laying mammals. But those of us, even the marsupials, who do a fair amount of gestation internally, now have moved the amniotic, developed in an amniotic sac that's internal to the mother. Right? So we are still amniotes, even though we're not egg-laying amniotes. It's all internally done. And so there's this strong correlation then between being terrestrial and having this amniotic structure, although some terrestrial animals have gone back to aquatic life, as I pointed out, they're still amniotic. There's all kinds of developmental advantages that might produce. Longer gestation, all sorts of things that might actually end up with cognitive implications. And there's also other things that go along with being amniotic, not perfectly, but thermoregulation, for instance, is really different in air than it is in water, right? And so that's why you find mammals and birds are internal temperature regulators to much greater degree than fish, although there are some fish species that do that as well. So there's a whole constellation of characteristics that come along with being terrestrial, essentially, being a terrestrial vertebrate in particular, that may in fact have scaffolded then certain kinds of developmental life histories, which then allow for different kinds of cognitive development, which allow then for emergent forms of complex consciousness. So that's the best I can do to tell you why certain people think that that is the right place to be looking. But to come back again to an earlier point, we focus on the origins of consciousness in vertebrates. Even Feinberg and Mallet argue that some invertebrate lineages may have independently evolved consciousness. So one of the things we know from evolution generally is this phenomenon of convergent evolution. So in body and form, cetaceans have some similar structures to fish, right? The demands of living in that way just end up sort of leading to similar structures. And one could say the same about the kinds of structures that support consciousness. So maybe octopus are conscious, even though they accomplish all of this kind of complex coupling and information integration and everything else I've been talking about on a bunch of components and structures that are really quite different because of their very different evolutionary histories.
Okay, so I've kept you almost for 2 hours, so let me close with the last question, which is, what questions do you wish more people would work on?
Oh, what questions do I wish more people would work on? I think this is one of the things about human creativity and ingenuity and so on. I'm not sure that I want to narrow down to some set of questions, but I would come back to your very first question and really talk about how I would like people to work on those questions. So it comes back to sort of this natural philosophy gambit, which says, look, you really, in order to understand these things, need to gather information from as many sources as possible. And systematic empirical research is one of the very best sources we have. It's not the only source. And any theory that we develop is going to have to take that very, very seriously. So I wish people would, in some sense, the narrow answer to your question, yeah, I wish people, philosophers, let's say, would spend more time thinking carefully about varieties of learning. But I see that as in the service of this much larger way of going about understanding ourselves, our own, the world that we live in, our place in that world, and so on. I think that we need real detail, but also real comprehensive understanding of information from whatever source we can get it.
Colin, thank you very much.
Yeah, thank you. That was a lot of fun. Great questions too.
Thank you.